Just 1 month after the release of Yakuza Dead Souls, series creator and producer Toshihiro Nagoshi would sit down for an interview with Weekly Famitsu. The main purpose of this interview was to officially announce that Yakuza 5 was in development, but alongside this announcement, he would also mention that a sequel to Kurohyou had been started, with Syn Sophia once again working alongside the team at Sega for it. Shortly after this interview was released, a trailer would be put up showing off some footage for the game and confirming the title as Kurohyou 2 Ryuga Gotoku Ashura Hen, which is yet another mouthful of a title that roughly translates to Black Panther 2 Like a Dragon Ashura Chapter. And those of you who saw my video on the first Kurohyou would know that this was a title that absolutely deserved a sequel, as I and many others out there genuinely believe it to be one of the strongest entries in the entire Yakuza franchise. But would the teams at Sega and Syn Sophia be able to recapture that pure PSP magic of the first game here? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 8th in a series of videos where I'm playing every game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. I started this journey so that I would be properly prepared for the release of Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, and clearly that's going really well. You don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, but I would highly recommend that you've at least seen my video on the first Kurohyou game, since I'll be comparing Kurohyou 2 to its predecessor quite a bit throughout the video. So for those of you that are interested, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Kurohyou 2 Ryuga Gotoku Ashura Hen is an action-adventure game that was developed by Sega and Syn Sophia and published for the PlayStation Portable in 2012. The game takes place a little more than 1 year after the events of the original, and in it, we once again play as Tatsuya Ukiyo, returning protagonist from the first game who, in the time since, has been traveling the world and training to become a professional boxer. At the beginning of the game, Tatsuya returns to Kamurocho to prepare for his pro debut in the boxing world. But he quickly learns that while he was away, a gang calling themselves the Ashura have come up to Tokyo from the Kansai region and are going around attacking the various gangs of Kamurocho. Tatsuya wastes no time in figuring out what's going on, and we pretty quickly learn that the Ashura are causing trouble because they want to take control of Dragon Heat, and have made a deal with the Tojo clan in order to try to get it. The Tojo and the Ashura have set up a series of fights in Dragon Heat and the Ashura Arena in Osaka between their strongest fighters, and the first of them to win 8 fights against the other will get to permanently keep Dragon Heat. Tatsuya hears this, and feeling like he owes a great deal to Dragon Heat after everything that happened the year before, decides to give up his professional boxing debut to instead fight for the Tojo in this war against the Ashura. And while doing so, he also takes on a bit of a mentorship role for some of the younger Dragon Heat fighters, as he sees a bit of his younger self in each and every one of them. This is a really good setup for the story, and allows Tatsuya to take on a much more mature role after completing his character arc in the first game. On top of just dropping his new career in order to fight for those he cares about, he also gets to effectively raise up the next generation of Dragon Heat fighters, and help them learn the same lessons that he did in the previous game, which is just really nice to see. But unfortunately, it's not all perfect, because we actually end up getting some pretty similar narrative issues here to the ones that we saw back in Yakuza 3. See, since Tatsuya's character arc was entirely finished at the end of the prior game, the writers took a totally different approach for Kurohyou 2's story. Rather than every chapter in the game offering a new chance for Tatsuya to grow, they instead offer some of the younger Dragon Heat fighters a chance to grow, and Tatsuya steps in to guide them along and make sure that they learn the right lessons to end up on a good path. I'm personally a big sucker for stories centered around fostering the next generation, so I love this approach on paper, but Kurohyou 2's story is an incredibly slow burn. It feels very similar to how the orphanage portions of the story hurt the pacing back in Yakuza 3, since it often feels like the progression of the main plot is just put to the side for an hour or two so that Tatsuya can go and help one of the younger fighters with an unrelated problem. But I actually feel that it's significantly worse in Kurohyou 2 than it was in Yakuza 3, because I didn't get truly invested in the story until Chapter 8 of the game. Which, by the way, there are only 10 story chapters in this one, so I wasn't really enjoying the story all that much until roughly the last quarter of the game. Now that being said, the final quarter of the story here is utterly fantastic. All that buildup and time spent with the younger fighters allows for some incredibly satisfying moments near the end, where you see just how much Tatsuya's rubbed off on them. This, again, reminds me of Yakuza 3's story, because those earlier portions of the story are definitely way too slow and have a negative impact on the overall pacing, but these more emotional moments later on just wouldn't work anywhere near as well without them. On a more positive note though, Kurohyou 2 has some of the best antagonists in the entire series up to this point, with one in particular potentially being my absolute favorite. The Yakuza series is no stranger to charismatic antagonists, but from the games I've played so far, Ryo Nozaki has to take the cake as the most interesting. Ryo is the main doctor within Ashura's fighting ring, and while he doesn't seem like much of an antagonist when we first meet him, his presence in the story becomes more and more menacing as time goes on. Along with being an apparent miracle worker when it comes to healing the injured fighters, Ryo is also a bit of a clairvoyant, being able to see glimpses of the future and tell people their fortunes. This ability directly clashes with the philosophy that Tatsuya developed throughout the first game, with him believing that fate or destiny are complete nonsense, and that everyone makes their own destiny through the actions they take in life. Through these conflicting beliefs, we regularly see Ryo give Tatsuya a haunting premonition of things to come, only for Tatsuya to actively fight against and subvert his own fate when he realizes those predictions are about to come true. This dynamic between the two is easily the highlight of the entire game for me, and it only gets better and better as the game goes on and we learn more about the Ashura, their origins, and just how dangerous they truly are. I can't fully explain why I loved this character so much without getting into nearly 10 minutes of spoilers, as there's a lot behind him and all of that information comes in like the last 1 or 2 story chapters. But believe me when I say that he's easily up there with characters like Ryuji Goda or Yoshitaka Mine. Overall, I enjoyed the story of Kurohyou 2 quite a bit, but I definitely can't say that it's as good as the originals. The last 3 chapters are genuinely fantastic, but the first 7 of them could feel like a slog to get through a lot of the time because the pacing is just so poor. Which is unfortunate because it's left me feeling incredibly mixed on the story as a whole. I really do want to recommend it to you guys just because of how awesome the last few hours of it are, but for the first 20 or so hours of my playthrough, I was expecting this portion of the video to just be a rant about how almost nothing that's important to the main plot ever happens. Ultimately though, I would say that if you're someone who plays these games for the combat or the open world first and foremost, I could still definitely recommend Kurohyou 2 to you. But if you play these games mainly for the story, then I could really only recommend this one to you if you have the patience of a monk. If nothing else though, at least those manga style cutscenes return here because, man, they still just look awesome. But moving on from the story, I feel like it's best to go over the combat next, as it's easily the most noteworthy part of the Kurohyou games. Most of the core combat system has been brought straight over from the first game. Of course, it still plays like a traditional 3D fighter rather than using a more free-flowing beat-em-up system like the rest of the Yakuza games. Players can still unlock a large variety of fighting styles throughout the game, and leveling up and training these fighting styles will lead to new moves being unlocked, as well as late-game unlockable styles that are unique fusions of multiple martial art forms. And the enemies here are still completely capable of utilizing all the tools the player can, so players will need to approach every encounter with a good amount of strategy in order to be successful. But in that roughly year and a half that they had to work on the sequel, they rebalanced a lot of the existing mechanics, as well as added a ton of new ones on top of that. Easily my favorite of these is that there's a new shove mechanic that you can use after grabbing an enemy, and these open up a ton of cool new interactions. The coolest of these is that you can now shove enemies into a wall to stun them up against it, allowing you a free opportunity to throw any of your strongest attacks or to activate one of the new wall heat actions. These not only look awesome, but also reward players with a genuine heat action at the cost of none of their heat. That's right, these wall heat actions actually don't cost you any of your heat, and you don't have to be in heat to activate them either. If you manage to stun an enemy up against a wall, you get to activate one no matter what. And you don't even have to shove an enemy to get this stun effect, as any attack that's strong enough to send them flying back could potentially result in one of these wall splats happening. It's just a really fun addition, and an especially useful one when you're fighting in the octagons of Dragon Heat or the Ashura Arena. They've also added things like proper throw breaks and get-up options here, though their implementation is a bit questionable. If an enemy grabs you and tries to execute a throw afterwards, you can break out of that throw instantly by simply pressing the same button that the enemy would have used to initiate the throw. So if their throw is executed by pressing square while holding onto you, you can press square yourself to quickly escape. This is a fun idea, but there's a weird conflict with an existing mechanic from Kurohyou 1 that led to me only being able to successfully execute this during the tutorial for it. See, Kurohyou has a number of ways that you can be stunned or dazed during a fight, and if an enemy grabs you during one of these stunned states, you won't be able to break the throw or even escape the grab whatsoever. And due to how slow the grab animation is in Kurohyou, the only way that you'll realistically be grabbed by an enemy the majority of the time is if they grab you while you're stunned. The same thing affects the get-up kicks and punches, as you aren't able to execute them after being stunned and knocked to the ground. Which, again, almost any attack that will knock you to the ground in the first place will do so after stunning you. So while these could have been a good couple of ways to flesh out the combat mechanics a bit more, the opportunities to make use of them are just so rare that they don't really have much of an impact. Something that you'll see a lot of, though, is that spectators of street fights will now actually get involved from time to time. This can take the form of them throwing objects into the arena, or in some cases, grabbing a fighter who wanders near the edge of the arena and holding them in place for a few seconds. This adds a really fun level of chaos to the street fights in this game, as an excited crowd might go after the enemies and try to help you out, or they might go after you. And even though it can be a bit annoying when you get grabbed and an enemy gets a free hit on you because of it, it's also really fun when an enemy gets grabbed and you get a free hit on them. It's definitely something that will lead to the occasional frustration, but I personally just found it way too fun to really complain about. And one of the coolest additions here is the new Clash minigame. If your attack and an enemy's land on one another at the exact same time, it will trigger this new Clash minigame where you have to pass more QTE checks than the enemy. And if you win one of these minigames, you get to mash one of the face buttons to throw as many punches in a short amount of time as you can. This isn't something that you'll see pop up all that often, but when it does happen, it will deal enough damage to easily bring down any enemy in the game that's not a main story boss. So it's a fun little minigame that pops up once every couple hours or so, looks really cool, and does a ton of damage to the enemy if you can pass the skill check, meaning it's an all-around win for me. All of these new combat mechanics just bring even more options to Kurohyou's gameplay, which I already praised for having the most depth out of any of the Yakuza games so far, but there is a major issue here. That issue being that the balancing in Kurohyou 2 is terrible. This is less to do with the actual combat mechanics themselves, and more to do with the overall systems design. And the best way that I can really explain it is by using the random battles as an example. The random battle system is basically unchanged from Kurohyou 1 in terms of their frequency and the way that they're triggered, but they've been rebalanced in a way that's incredibly frustrating. Enemies in Kurohyou 2's random encounters are way stronger than the enemies of any Yakuza game so far, both in terms of how much health they have and how much damage they can deal to the player. This made for random battles that could take upwards of 5 minutes for me to actually get through, as well as the occasional one that I would get stuck on for upwards of 10 to 15 minutes because that one enemy was just so insanely strong. I mean, seriously, some of the random encounters that I had throughout my playthrough were considerably tougher than any of the main story bosses, and that's saying a lot because a couple of the late game bosses here can just stunlock you to death by spamming the same move over and over. The enemy AI in this game also has a tendency to parry nearly every basic attack that you throw at them, meaning the only consistently safe strategy to defeat 9 out of 10 enemies in the game is to just bait out an attack so that you can sidestep it and land a guaranteed counterattack. You do this on loop for a bit to build up some injuries on them, then start adding in some grab attacks and heat actions once they start to get worn down. This was already a dominant strategy for the boss fights in Kurohyou 1, but it's now become a mandatory strategy for even basic street thugs here in Kurohyou 2. There's actually a really great video on this from fellow Yakuza creator Devil Leon 7 that I'll link in the description for those of you that are interested in seeing just how bad it can get. It's about 15 minutes long, and it's entirely centered around how strong the enemies in this game are and just how much that drags down the actual gameplay. Add on to this issue that the majority of the random battles in this game give you next to no experience for completing them, and you have a recipe for disaster. You put in all that effort to defeat an enemy that's 1 or 2 levels below you in a street encounter, only to get like 30 XP out of the thousands, if not tens of thousands that you'll need to level up. But then you'll fight an enemy like an hour later that's nearly 10 levels below you in the main story, and they'll give you like 800 XP as a reward, for a fight that lasts like 10 seconds. And unlike Kurohyou 1, where you would level up your stats by spending money at the dojo, you actually do have to gain experience here and level them through the skill points you earn on a level up. So grinding random encounters is a necessity if you want to keep yourself at a high enough level for the main story. So not only do the random encounters here waste a ton of your time while also being pretty frustrating, but they give you next to no reward for actually completing them, which just leads to Kurohyou 2 being easily the grindiest game I've played in the series so far. As one last note on the combat before moving on though, they've added an awesome new fighting style in the form of the self-taught style. When you first unlock this near the end of the main story, it will be completely identical to the Street Brawler style, but the gimmick here is that the self-taught style is completely customizable. You can choose what styles punches, kicks, grab attacks, and heat moves you want, and mix and match them with complete freedom. This is an incredibly fun late game reward, and the only way that it could be any better in my mind is if the various grab attacks and heat actions could be customized individually rather than just being entire categories. But this is already just so much fun to mix and match and play around with that it's basically impossible for me to complain, so I'll just leave it at this is fucking awesome and I can't believe they didn't have it in the first game. But that's about everything I can think to talk about with the combat, so let's move on to what ultimately made Kurohyou 1 my favorite game in the series so far, the open world and the side content. And to start this section off, we have the most important thing about the game that I haven't brought up yet. That being that Kurohyou 1 is another Yakuza title that has 2 open world maps to explore. We have Kamurocho as usual because, of course we do, but with the Ashura being from Osaka, we also get the return of the Sotenbori map from Yakuza 2. And much like how the team at Sega has always handled the Kamurocho map, the Sotenbori map brings back pretty much every single location and business from Yakuza 2, as well as expanding on it with a whole bunch of new businesses and attractions. I don't know if it's the nostalgia talking since I started my Yakuza journey with the PS2 games, but Sotenbori is probably my favorite secondary map from the series so far. So it was a very pleasant surprise when I went into Kurohyou 2 completely blind and then was dropped into the map of Sotenbori again a couple hours in. Having 2 maps available naturally expands the amount of side content on offer, and that's a good thing because much like the first game, Kurohyou 2 is absolutely at its best when you're engaging with the side content. The sub-stories are still really good here, and there's even a massive string of sub-stories that serve as a follow-up to the string of sub-stories from the first game centering around a massive gang war in Kamurocho. So you get to see a ton of returning characters who only ever appeared in the sub-stories of the first game, which while that's nothing new for the Yakuza series, it's just really nice to see them do it in these little PSP spin-offs as well. Most of Kurohyou 2's minigames are also just ones that have been brought over from the original, but a lot of them have been updated or overhauled so that they play significantly better than they did in the first one. The addition of Sotenbori also means that some of the minigames we saw in Yakuza 2 have returned, like for example, the driving range is back here. And again, much like the first game, a lot of the minigames here that are from the home console entries still just aren't as good as they were on the PS2 or the PS3, but you gotta give them at least a little credit for bringing them over how they could. Some completely new minigames have been added here as well, with my favorite of these easily being the new Castle of the Dead arcade game. This one is an on-rails shooter that pays homage to Yakuza Dead Souls, with us shooting at pop-up targets of the various zombie models seen in that game. I probably only enjoyed this one so much because my previous 2 videos on the channel were for Dead Souls and Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles, but it genuinely was the one that I had the most fun with during my playthrough and one that I thought deserved a special little mention here. The part-time job minigames return here as well, once again with all of them from the first game getting small improvements and touch-ups to just make them a little more enjoyable. They even now have a bunch of difficulty levels that you can choose from when starting a shift, with higher difficulties naturally netting you more pay for a proper completion. To gain access to these higher difficulties, you will have to work each individual job multiple times and perform well enough over and over again to earn a promotion, which while it does add a little more grindiness to the game overall, it's completely optional and does just allow for you to earn a little more money at some of your favorite jobs if you do them over and over. And of course, they've also added a couple of new part-time jobs for Sotenbori, with both of them revolving around making popular street foods that Osaka has become known for, like takoyaki and kushikatsu. So all up, these are still fun little mini-games that reward you with a ton of extra cash for playing them, so they're still a massive positive if you ask me. And as one final note on the minigames here, I have to mention that Kurohyou 2 actually has the best Hostess Bar minigame in the series so far. It's got some really well-written dialogue, is still hilariously the best looking part of the game, and even has some new things like little QuickTime events where Tatsuya will nervously spill water on the hostess and you have to catch the glass before it lands on them. Just really good stuff all around, and while I never end up spending too much time at the hostess bars in these games, this one definitely deserved a shout out. And these last couple things are just some miscellaneous points that I definitely wanted to bring up, but just didn't really fit neatly anywhere else in the script. But this is the first Yakuza game where you can actually customize your character's outfit during the main story. The team at Sega reached out to a ton of Japanese clothing brands during the development to see if they wanted to collaborate by designing some outfits for Tatsuya, and they managed to get a bunch of different companies to take them up on that offer. So as you play the game, you can go out and buy some new outfits for Tatsuya that were put together by real Japanese fashion designers, which while I don't love every single one of them by any means, I think that's a really cool touch. And I saved this really big one for last, but Kurohyou 2 is the first game in the series that not only allows you to just save from the pause menu rather than finding a save point in the world, but also features an autosave system. This is just a huge quality of life change for the series because sometimes when you're out there grinding out side activities, you just want to quickly save and get up for a break without needing to run to the nearest save point and potentially run into a bunch of random battles along the way. And the auto-saving is really nice because sometimes games will just freeze or crash unexpectedly. And there was actually one instance during my playthrough where the autosave prevented me from losing about an hour of progress during my playthrough due to a random freeze. I never necessarily had an issue with the old save system in the series, but this is just a really nice evolution, and one that I would love to see pop up in future mainline entries as well. Overall though, I have some fairly mixed feelings on Kurohyou 2. I was super excited going into this one, as it is the direct sequel to my favorite game in the series so far, but I just really didn't enjoy it as much as I did Kurohyou 1. It has some good additions to the combat, but the balancing is just so poor that it makes it hard to really enjoy those additions to their full potential. The story gets really good near the end, but the first 7 of the 10 story chapters have some really poor pacing and are often just boring to get through. The only thing that I would say is significantly improved from the first game would be the side content and the open world, but the terrible balancing in the random encounters unfortunately ends up dragging that stuff down too. Now don't get me wrong, Kurohyou 2 is still a fairly enjoyable experience, but it's just one that I felt was significantly weaker than its predecessor, and it's probably one that's just on the weaker side of the Yakuza series in general if you're asking me. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Kurohyou 2 Ryuga Gotoku Ashura Hen a 7.8. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of another video. Sorry if my voice sounded a little weird in this one, it's really been struggling all week and I think I'm on the verge of losing it, but I thankfully managed to get this recorded before that happened. If you stuck around this long though, I'm assuming you enjoyed the video, so feel free to throw a like or a sub my way to help out with that whole algorithm thing. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out my channel memberships or my Patreon, and joining the amazing group of people who make series like this one truly possible. With all that said though, I'm gonna have to get back to work on the next one, but in the meantime, you might be able to check out one of these playlists on screen if you're looking for more. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.